A salute.
Keating was always an instinct politician, pragmatic, ambitious. He wanted to learn. I think right from the start he was hurtling towards the Prime Ministership, a very, very ambitious product of the New South Wales right, who got into politics early, and the interesting thing about him was he kept developing.
You know, I started work when I was 15 years of age in the Sydney County Council in Sydney. I mean, I was down those substations under the ground at 7:30 in the morning with the cockroaches running up your legs.
He wanted to have a real influence on political events in Australia, both policies and positions. He wanted to call the shots, if you like. But I didn't realise until, you know, some time later, say the mid-70s, that he was a guy who actually saw himself getting to the very top of the pile.
I don't resile from the fact that I have personal ambitions, but they're nothing like the ambitions I have for Australia.
When he was the Shadow Minister for Minerals and Energy, he addressed the Sydney Chamber of Commerce, and in his usual style he lambasted the banks and described all the chief executives as drones. So I suggested a meeting, and he came and had lunch with me and some of my colleagues, and I was so impressed at the time with his with the breadth of his knowledge and understanding of the financial system that I forecast that he had to be the Prime Minister one day.
All right, G-Man, give it to him. Suck it to him.
All right. Can I have some attention over at the back?
The future Prime Minister was tutored in one of the toughest political schools in the country.
There'll certainly be no change of the situation in New South Wales.
That's right, yeah.
I'm bloody right.
The New South Wales Labor right.
They're not affirming by resolution.
No, well, I first knew him when he was in the Young Labor Council, when he was the president of the Young Labor Council. He was a pretty tough cookie. They were rough days where debates were raucous, sometimes physical, but always tough. And of course he revelled in that. I think that's where he cut his political teeth.
If one is not street smart in politics, you really don't have much of an idea of what the average person's thinking. I mean, one has to keep in touch with the views of most Australians.
Is Paul Keating the ultimate product of the New South Wales right, do you think?
Well, undoubtedly their best product. I don't know whether you would say ultimate, but undoubtedly their best.
I was talking to Kim Beazley Senior one day in King's Hall, and this was back in the early 1970s, and Paul Keating walked across King's Hall on the other side, and Kim said to me, "You see that man over there? Watch him. He's a political killer." And I think there's a lot in that comment of Beazley's.
Paul Keating had a taste of power as Minerals and Energy Minister in the closing days of the Whitlam government.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
Sidelined by Malcolm Fraser's big victory, the ambitious Keating, now Shadow Resources Minister, was determined to draw blood.
Once you push Paul and he's into something, he masters the brief very quickly, and he became, in Parliament, the complete master of the portfolio. So they had to shift, I think the Fraser government had to shift the ministry out of the reps and put it in the Senate to protect the incumbent from Paul getting at him.
Old Jack Lang said to me when I was a kid, he said, when you go there, he said, they'll all tell you you've got plenty of time, but the truth is you haven't got a second to lose.
Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, Keating's star rose, as did the influence of the New South Wales right.
He was a product of what the right was in the 50s. It was pretty much a Catholic-dominated show, well, and that faded 20 years ago. Paul, I think, had an influence in broadening what New South Wales Labor was all about.
It wasn't that many years ago. I was that far on the outer at Victoria, it wasn't funny. When I used to be the president of the New South Wales Labor Party, up there we still start half the branch meetings with a Hail Mary.
Increasingly, the New South Wales right, with Keating at the helm, set the Labor Party agenda, stitched up the deals.
Millions of Australians who deserve and need a Labor victory and the end of Fraserism will be best served by Bob Hawke now becoming leader.
The man who has claimed victory in this election, Mr. Bob Hawke, and his wife Hazel, who's now being greeted by Paul Keating.
The real point about Hawke and Keating is they were a fantastic partnership. They always worked well together in a policy sense. Now, it's true that there were tensions between them, and those tensions got worse as we went through the 1980s. But the really important point is that they collaborated together enormously effective. This is one of the great partnerships in the history of Australian politics.
Hawke had won power preaching consensus. Keating, his hard-nosed treasurer-to-be, was sceptical about the approach, especially the attempts in the run-up to the election to reach a prices and incomes accord with the trade union movement.
Well, I think it's true to say that it started off a fairly negative relationship. Paul walked into the final meeting that we were there to discuss the accord and basically said that he didn't believe in accords and incomes policies, not much future, but it was the election, he couldn't do much about it, so let's cement it.
Kelty and Keating didn't know each other. They were strangers. I mean, Kelty didn't want Keating as treasurer. He wanted Ralph Willis. Ralph came from Melbourne. He came from the ACTU. He was family. Keating was a stranger.
I know people say there's not the time for consensus. It's not the time for cooperation. But I don't agree. When you have hard times, when you have tough times, you want a nation to pull together. You don't want a nation to pull apart.
So when did the turning point come for Paul Keating then?
Well, I think you've got to understand that the first day, the very first day, it was clear that there had to be a substantial devaluation of the currency. So the very first day, the newly elected government had to have some understanding with the union movement about how to handle the devaluation. Because the worst thing that could happen would be a position where the currency was devalued and the union said, well, we're going to chase the claim in the field for higher prices and consequently have a never-ending devaluation.
The interesting thing is there was this fantastic chemistry that grew between Kelty and Keating, simply because they were both ambitious, they were both reform-minded, they wanted to change the country.
I think the closeness arose out of a sense of comradeship, trying to do the right thing. We had to make some pretty tough decisions. I've had to go out and argue for wage restraint when other people weren't restraining their incomes. That was a pretty hard thing for trade union movement leader to do.
We've engaged ourselves in an enormous clearing exercise to clear away a very large part of the programs of the former government. The decision to float means that the speculators will now be speculating against themselves rather than against the Australian government via the Reserve Bank.
The floating of the dollar, the Australian dollar in December '83, and the abolition of the exchange control regulations virtually opened us up to the whole of the international financial community. And whilst I think that process was inevitable because it was happening elsewhere, I admired the courage of Keating to take that dramatic step.
I had no argument with his policies in that area because they were mine. And one of the reasons he was able to do them so easily was that he always had the support of the Liberal Party, and that's a fact that's overlooked.
Keating is not just a stereotype New South Wales right-wing politician. A stereotype right-wing politician from New South Wales would never have introduced the sort of reforms that Paul Keating did in the 1980s. Deregulation of the financial system, opening up the economy, attempting to make the economy internationally competitive. These are not New South Wales right-wing policies.
In the eyes of Jack Lang and Rex Connor, Keating's radical departure from traditional Labor attitudes might have been condemned as class treachery.
If Lang and Connor had a weakness, it was not to understand the importance of business and business investment. I mean, I think they saw things a little bit more along the class war lines. And that's the leap that Paul was able to make. And I think helped taking the Labor Party, along with Bob Hawke, in that direction, to understand that profit wasn't a dirty word. I mean, it wasn't until 1975 the Labor Party ever recognised that you're allowed to have it.
If you want to start talking about equity and fairness, you better start with unemployment. But you can't do it with a sick economy. Banking is the artery of the economy, and we've had hardening of the arteries for too long in this country.
I think Keating, as Peter Walsh once said, was a born political salesman. He was very good at selling his policy prescriptions during the course of the 1980s. He didn't so much sell his personality, but he did sell his ideas, and he was very good at that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Very good.
His measures have been bold, brilliant, and above all, brave.
By 1984, Mr Keating was basking in international acclaim for the hard sell he'd done on deregulation down under.
And to ask you to accept this souvenir, have it to hold until you're Prime Minister.
Emboldened by his success, the Treasurer set himself another daunting challenge: reforming the tax system.
Your participation in this conference represents in itself a remarkable demonstration of the strength and vigour of the Australian democracy and the Australian democratic process.
The political mood that the popular Prime Minister and his gung-ho Treasurer had been setting had suddenly turned sour.
And I acknowledge that.
Opposition to a capital gains tax, Mr Keating's version of a GST and other proposed changes united the community against the government.
Paul Keating thought that probably business would come to the party and do a deal. In other words, they badly wanted a broad-based consumption tax. Their desires might be so strong that they would buy the other nasties. And I think there he misjudged the feeling.
It was Mr Keating who had most to gain from presiding over so radical a tax shake-up. And it was Mr Keating whose power and prestige were at stake in the shakedown with unions and the business bosses.
The Keating-Kelty partnership came unstuck over the consumption tax.
I mean, if all you had to do was have a new tax and pass a piece of legislation through Parliament, and some way we had economic nirvana, well, we'd only have to have Parliament sit once every decade. Paul said there were no magic puddings. There are no magic puddings and there are no magic elixirs. Life is a lot tougher than that.
I think that the general tone of many of the comments have been divided, sectional and too uncompromising in tone.
I felt on Thursday that he was a deserted man. In fact, when we were called, we, the representatives of the business sector, were called to the Prime Minister's department, or Prime Minister's office, on the final day of the summit, during the lunch break, to be told that it was all finished and there would be some modified tax scheme, but there would not be a broad-based consumption tax. It was obvious that there had been